February 1937 at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, the air was thick with the scent of high-octane fuel and the desperate ambition of men who knew a storm was gathering over Europe. It was 10 a.m. when the United States Army Air Corps released Circular Proposal X-608, a document that should have been a routine request for a new interceptor, but instead became a death sentence for conventional aviation thinking. The military was not looking for another nimble biplane or a slightly faster version of what they already had. They were demanding the impossible. They wanted a fighter capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at an altitude of 20,000 feet, armed with a heavy cannon and capable of climbing to that height in under 6 minutes. At the time, the world's fastest fighters were struggling to break 300. To the engineers at Lockheed in Burbank, California, this was not just a contract offer. It was a dare that would reshape the geography of the sky. In the late 1930s, the Standard Fighter was a single-engine machine, built for dogfighting in tight circles. It was an era of grace and lightness, where the pilot's skill in a turn was the measure of success. But Lockheed was a company known for transport planes, not killers. When the legary Clarence Kelly Johnson and Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard sat down at their drafting tables at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, they did not look at what Curtiss or Bell were doing. They looked at the laws of physics and realized that the single-engine monoplane had reached a bottleneck. The engines of the day simply could not provide enough thrust to push a heavily armed airframe through the air at the speeds the Army demanded. To get the power required, they needed more than any single engine on the planet could provide. They needed two. This was a radical departure from every established rule of air combat. A twin-engine fighter was supposed to be a heavy, sluggish beast, easily picked apart by more agile single-engine opponents. But Johnson and Hibbard were not building a traditional fighter. They were building a high-altitude assassin. They took two Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engines and wrapped them in a design that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The result was the twin-boom configuration, where the engines, turbo-superchargers, and landing gear were housed in two long, elegant tails, while the pilot and the weaponry sat in a central pod. It was a shape born of necessity, designed to reduce drag while providing the massive surface area needed for cooling those high-performance engines. The genius of this design was not just in its power, but in its lethality. Because the engines were out on the wings, the nose of the aircraft was free. For the first time, a fighter would not have to worry about synchronization gears that allowed bullets to pass through spinning propeller blades. They could pack 450 caliber machine guns and a massive 20mm cannon right in the center of the nose. This meant the pilot did not have to worry about convergence zones, where bullets from different wings met at a certain distance. If a pilot could point the nose at a target, he could shred it with a concentrated stream of lead and steel from any range. It was a surgical tool in a world of blunt instruments. When the blueprints were finalized at 4:15 p.m. on the day of the submission, the Lockheed team knew they were gambling the company future on a machine that looked like a nightmare to fly. Critics called it too complex, too expensive, and too heavy. The Army brass looked at the model and saw a freak of engineering. Yet, beneath that bizarre silhouette was a calculated defiance of the status quo. It was a machine built for a war that had not started yet, entered for distances and altitudes that were still considered theoretical. This was the birth of the P-38 Lightning, a plane that would eventually become the terror of the Pacific and the spearhead of the Mediterranean. It was born from the realization that the old ways of thinking were no longer enough to survive the coming darkness. The radical design of the 1937 specification proved that sometimes, to win a war, you have to break the very rules that defined the era. It was not just about building a better plane. It was about reimagining what a fighter could be. Looking back, this moment at Wright Field represents the pivot point between the romantic age of the biplane and the brutal technological dominance of modern air power. The Lightning did not just meet the specification. It shattered the expectations of what a human could achieve in the cockpit. It serves as a poignant reminder that the most significant leaps in human history rarely come from following the path of least resistance. They come from the brave, often lonely decision to look at a set of rules and decide they no longer apply. The legacy of that 1937 requirement is found not just in the scrap metal of fallen planes, but in the enduring spirit of innovation that refuses to be grounded by the weight of tradition. It remains a testament to the idea that when the stakes are life and death, the most radical idea is often the only one that can truly soar. January 27, 1937, at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The United States Army Air Corps issued a challenge that would effectively the era of the biplane and demand a future that many believed was physically impossible. Circular Proposal X-608 called for an interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at an altitude of 20,000 feet. To the aviation giants of the time, these numbers were not just ambitious. They were a death sentence for traditional design. Most engines in the late 30s simply lacked the raw power to push a heavy airframe through the thin, frigid air of the upper atmosphere while maintaining such staggering speeds. At Lockheed, a young and brilliant engineer named Kelly Johnson and his visionary boss, Hal Hibbard, realized that to follow the rules of the past was to invite failure. They knew that a single engine, no matter how refined, could not provide the thrust required while also hauling the fuel and heavy armament necessary for modern combat. The decision to move to a twin-engine platform was the first of many gambles. While two engines provided more power, they also doubled the drag and added immense weight. The solution developed by the Lockheed team, known internally as Model 22, was a radical departure from everything the world knew about fighter aesthetics. They did not just place two engines on a wing. They reimagined the entire skeleton of the aircraft. By utilizing a twin-boom configuration, they could house the massive Allison V1710 engines, the cooling systems, and the heavy landing gear in two streamlined pods that stretched back to a shared horizontal stabilizer. This left the pilot in a central pod, free from the vibration of a nose-mounted engine, and perhaps most importantly, allowed the weaponry to be concentrated in the nose. Unlike the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt, which had to deal with the complexities of synchronizing guns to fire through a propeller or outward from the wings, the P-38 could rain a concentrated stream of 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon directly ahead, as straight and true as a sniper rifle. However, the true heart of this mechanical monster was not just the twin-boom layout, but the integration of General Electric turbo superchargers. To achieve high-altitude dominance, the engines needed to breathe. At 30,000 feet, the air is too thin for a standard engine to function effectively. The turbo supercharger solved this by using the engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which in turn compressed the intake air. But the engineering required to make this work was a logistical nightmare. The exhaust had to be piped from the engine, back through the booms into the turbo units, and then the compressed air had to be cooled before being sent back to the engine. This created a plumbing system of such complexity that it looked more like an industrial refinery than a fighter plane. The heat generated was intense enough to melt aluminum if not managed correctly, requiring innovative ducting and cooling scoops that gave the aircraft its distinctive, aggressive silhouette. The plumbing of the cooling system was a masterpiece of thermal management. The air was compressed by the turbochargers at the rear of the booms, reaching temperatures that could compromise the engine's integrity. To combat this, Johnson and his team integrated intercoolers into the leading edges of the wings and the sides of the booms. This meant that as the aircraft sped through the air, the freezing atmosphere of high altitude would naturally cool the compressed air before it reached the cylinders. Every curve of the P-38 had a purpose, every vent a life-saving function. It was a symphony of metal and thermodynamics that required thousands of hours of wind tunnel testing to perfect. By the time the prototype, the XP-38, took to the skies at 9 a.m. on January 27, 1939, it was clear that Lockheed had built something that defied the laws of the status quo. It was a machine of contradictions. It was massive, yet incredibly fast, complex, yet devastatingly effective. It was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour, proving that the twin-boom revolution was not just a design quirk, but a necessary evolution. Looking back at those frantic months of development, the P-38 Lightning stands as a monument to the moment when engineering stopped being an iterative process and became a revolutionary one. It reminds us that the most daunting challenges are not overcome by doing things better, but by doing them differently. The legacy of the twin-boom design is a reminder that in the face of impossible odds, the greatest risk is not the radical idea, but the safety of the familiar. It is the story of how a group of dreamers looked at the horizon and decided that if the physics of the day would not allow them to fly, they would simply rewrite the laws of flight themselves. The P-38 did not just win battles. It proved that the only limits to human achievement are the ones we refuse to ignore. February 11, 1939, at Mitchell Field on Long Island, a crowd of military officials and reporters stood in stunned silence as a twin-engine Silver Streak plummeted toward the Earth, inching a record-breaking transcontinental flight in a heap of burning wreckage. This was the public debut of the XP-38, and while the pilot, Ben Kelsey, miraculously survived the crash, the aircraft that was supposed to redefine American air power lay in ruins. It was an omen of the brutal trials that awaited the Lockheed team. The P-38 Lightning was a machine that existed ahead of its time, a technological leap so vast that the very atmosphere seemed to rebel against its existence. This was the beginning of a saga of fire and failure, a period where the laws of aerodynamics had to be rewritten in the blood of test pilots. As the production lines began to churn out the early models in 1941, a terrifying phenomenon began to emerge during high-altitude testing. Pilots reported that during high-speed dives, usually initiated around 10 a.m. to take advantage of the clear morning air, the aircraft would suddenly stop responding to their inputs. As the needle on the airspeed indicator swept past 400 miles per hour, the nose would tuck downward with an irresistible force. The control column, usually light and responsive, would become as rigid as if it had been welded to the floor. The entire airframe would begin to shudder with a violent resonance that felt like an earthquake in the cockpit. This was the ghost of compressibility, a phenomenon no one truly understood because no one had ever flown fast enough to trigger it. On November 4, 1941, the cost of this ignorance became tragically clear. Lockheed's lead test pilot, Ralph Verdon, took off at 11:15 a.m. to test a new tail modification designed to stop the buffeting. High above the California landscape, he pushed the P-38 into a steep dive to reach the critical speeds where the vibrations began. Ground observers watched as the aircraft's tail section simply vanished, torn away by the sheer force of the air. The plane tumbled out of the sky, and Verdon was lost. The crash sent a wave of panic through the Army Air Corps. To many, it seemed the P-38 was a beautiful mistake, a plane too fast for its own structure, and a design that had reached the terminal limits of propeller-driven flight. Kelly Johnson, the brilliant lead engineer at Lockheed, refused to accept that the design was the problem. He realized that as the P-38 approached the speed of sound, the air flowing over the curved surface of the wings was accelerating even faster, creating localized shockwaves. These shockwaves were moving the center of lift and blanketing the tail's elevators in turbulent, dead air. The pilot wasn't losing control because the plane was broken. He was losing control because the air itself had changed state. To solve this, Lockheed engineers spent thousands of hours in the wind tunnels at Ames Aeronautical Laboratory, eventually developing small, wedge-shaped dive recovery flaps. These weren't meant to slow the plane down. but to change the pressure distribution on the wing just enough to restore the pilot's ability to pull out of a dive. This period of trial by fire was not merely an engineering hurdle. It was a psychological war for the pilots who had to fly the Lightning. To sit in a cockpit at 1 p.m., under the scorching sun, and know that a dive could lead to a permanent lock-in required a brand of courage that bordered on the suicidal. Yet, through these failures, the P-38 emerged as a more resilient and capable predator. The very issues that nearly grounded the project became the lessons that allowed American pilots to dominate the skies of the Pacific and Europe. By the time the aircraft reached full combat readiness, it was no longer the fragile experiment that had crashed at Mitchell Field. It was the fork-tailed devil, a machine that could outclimb, outgun, and outrange anything the Axis powers could put into the air. The legacy of the P-38's baptism by fire is a reminder that progress is rarely a smooth ascent. It is often a series of violent impacts and hard-won realizations. The Lightning did more than win dogfights. It forced humanity to confront the sound barrier for the first time, paving the way for the jet age that would follow just a few years later. It stands as a testament to the engineers who stared at a pile of wreckage and saw a path forward, and to the pilots who climbed back into the cockpit, knowing the air itself was their greatest enemy. The P-38 didn't just break the rules of air combat. It proved that the only way to reach the future is to fly straight through the obstacles that others claim are impossible to overcome. The sound of its twin engines was the sound of a new era being born, one where the speed of sound was no longer a wall, but a doorway. December 27, 1942, over the dense, steaming jungles of Buna, New Guinea. The roar of a different kind of engine announced a fundamental change in the balance of aerial power. For months, Allied pilots had struggled to match the agility of the Japanese Zero, a plane that danced through the clouds with a grace that seemed almost untouchable. But on this day, the twin-tailed silhouettes of the P-38 Lightning tore through the formation, proving that brute force and raw speed could rewrite the laws of the dogfight. This was the moment the Pacific Theater realized that the rules of engagement had been permanently discarded, replaced by a machine that refused to play by the old standards of maneuverability. The P-38 Lightning arrived in the Pacific not just as a reinforcement, but as a predator perfectly adapted to its environment. Unlike its single-engine cousins, the Lightning didn't rely on wing-mounted guns that required pilots to calculate complex convergence points where their bullets would meet. Everything it had, including 450 caliber machine guns and a devastating 20mm cannon, was packed tightly into the nose. This meant that from the moment a pilot squeezed the trigger at 8 a.m. until the last shell casing dropped at noon, the fire was a laser-straight beam of lead and high explosives. It didn't matter if the enemy was 100 yards away or 500. The P-38 hit exactly where it pointed. This concentrated fire could shred the unarmored frames of Japanese fighters in a single burst, turning a brief window of opportunity into a decisive kill. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, distance was as much an enemy as the Japanese Mitsubishi. Island hopping required a range that most fighters simply couldn't achieve without running their tanks dry long before the objective. The P-38, however, equipped with massive drop tanks, could fly thousands of miles over open ocean, strike a target, and return home safely. This capability was put to its most famous test on April 18, 1943. At 7:35 a.m., 18 Lightnings took off from Guadalcanal on a mission that seemed impossible, a 400-mile low-level flight to intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Flying just 30 feet above the waves to avoid radar detection, the pilots monitored their watches until precisely 9:33 a.m. when they spotted their targets over Bougainville. In a matter of minutes, the architect of Pearl Harbor was gone, and the Japanese leadership was left reeling from a blow delivered by a plane that shouldn't have been able to reach them. Names like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire became legs in this airframe, eventually becoming the top two scoring American aces of the entire war. Bong, the ace of aces, utilized the lightning's incredible climb rate and dive speed to strike and disappear before the more maneuverable enemy could even bring their guns to bear. By 3 p.m. on many a humid afternoon, Bong would return to base, having added another victory mark to his fuselage, proving that the Lightning's true strength lay in its ability to dictate the terms of the fight. If a P-38 pilot was smart, he never entered a slow-speed turning contest. He turned the sky into a high-speed expressway where only he had the keys to the vehicle. It was more than a fighter. It was a scout, a bomber, and a psychological weapon. The Japanese referred to it as 2 airplanes with 1 pilot, and the Germans on the other side of the world had already dubbed it the fork-tailed devil. It possessed a stability that made it an excellent platform for photography and ground attack. Yet for all its technical prowess, the P-38 remained a difficult beast to master. It required a pilot who respected its quirks, someone who understood that the counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque but demanded a delicate touch during high-speed dives. Looking back, the P-38 Lightning stands as a testament to the idea that innovation is often born from the brink of failure. It began as a radical experiment, an aircraft that many thought was too complex and too strange for the rigors of combat. It faced freezing cockpits in Europe and mechanical breakdowns in the desert. But in the Pacific, it found its soul. It was the bridge between the biplanes of the past and the jet age of the future. A machine that proved speed and range could conquer the largest ocean on Earth. As the sun sets over the quiet airfields where these engines once screamed, we are reminded that the legacy of the Lightning isn't just found in the metal and the rivets. It is found in the courage of the men who trusted their lives to an unorthodox design, believing that 2 engines were better than 1, when there was nothing but blue water for 1,000 miles in every direction. The P-38 didn't just win battles. It expanded the horizon of what human ingenuity could achieve under the most desperate of circumstances. It remains a symbol of a time when we dared to build something different, something strange, and something that, against all odds, changed the course of history forever. April 18, 1943, at the edge of a dirt runway on Guadalcanal, 18 pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron sat in their cockpits, listening to the synchronized hum of 36 Allison engines. They were about to embark on a mission that would have been impossible for any other fighter in the American inventory. The target was nearly 400 miles away, across a landscape of hostile islands and less ocean. For these men, the P-38 Lightning was more than just a weapon. It was a lifeline. In the Pacific, where a single mechanical failure usually meant a slow death in a life raft or a quick one in the waves, the presence of that second engine offered a psychological advantage that cannot be ignored. The Lightning gave them the confidence to push into the unknown, turning the vast reaches of the ocean from a barrier into a highway for American air power. This strategic reach was the direct result of Kelly Johnson's refusal to follow the rules of traditional fighter design. While other nations focused on making their planes smaller and lighter, Lockheed built a heavy, twin-engine behemoth that could carry massive drop tanks. By the time the sun began to rise over the Solomon Islands, the P-38 had already redefined the concept of escort duty. It wasn't just about protecting bombers. It was about the ability to project force with surgical precision at distances the enemy thought were safe. This was the essence of the mission to intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The American command knew that the architect of Pearl Harbor would be flying to the island of Balale, and they knew his arrival time was set for 9:35 a.m. to catch him. The Lightnings had to fly a circuitous, low-level route to avoid radar, navigating for hundreds of miles over the water without a single landmark to guide them. The pilots flew at an altitude of barely 50 feet, their prop wash kicking up salt spray from the whitecaps. For over 2 hours, they maintained total radio silence, relying on stopwatches and compass headings. It was a feat of navigation that pushed the limits of human endurance. At 9:34 a.m., Right on schedule, the flight leader signaled for the climb. As they surged upward through the tropical haze, they saw their prey. 2 Japanese Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros, were descending toward the airfield. The ambush was perfect. In the chaotic dogfight that followed, the P-38s used their superior speed and concentrated nose fire to tear through the formation. One of the bombers, carrying the Admiral, spiraled into the jungle of Bougainville. The mission was a success, not just because of the skill of the pilots, but because the P-38 possessed the unique combination of range and lethality required to execute such a daring strike. The Lightning's versatility went far beyond high-stakes interceptions. In the Mediterranean, it earned the nickname the Fork-tailed Devil from German pilots, who found that the P-38 could dive faster and climb harder than almost anything they put in the air. Because the guns were located in the nose rather than the wings, pilots didn't have to worry about the convergence of their bullets. They could strike targets with pinpoint accuracy from a distance of several hundred yards, making the Lightning an exceptional platform for ground attack and strafing runs against locomotives and shipping. Whether it was the cold, foggy air of the Aleutian Islands or the blistering heat of the Sahara, the aircraft adapted to every environment it encountered. Later in the war, the P-38 was modified into specialized roles that further demonstrated its flexible design. The F-4 and F-5 reconnaissance versions swapped guns for cameras, flying solo missions at high altitudes where their speed made them nearly impossible to intercept. There was even a version featuring a transparent nose and a bombardier station, allowing a flight of Lightnings to drop a concentrated load of bombs with the accuracy of a heavy bomber. No matter the task, the airframe proved it could handle the weight of innovation, becoming the backbone of tactical operations across every theater of the conflict. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning is not just one of mechanical excellence, but of a fundamental shift in how we perceive the utility of the fighter plane. It proved that a specialized machine could become a multi-role powerhouse through the sheer strength of its engineering. It was a bridge to the future, a precursor to the versatile aircraft that dominate the skies today. When we look back at the silver streaks crossing the Pacific sky, we see more than just a masterwork of aluminum and steel. We see the embodiment of the American spirit during the war, an insistence on going further, striking harder, and refusing to accept the limits of what was thought possible. The P-38 didn't just fight the war, it expanded the battlefield, leaving behind a world where the horizon was no longer a boundary, but an invitation to reach for the impossible. August 14, 1945, over the Japanese home islands. The last operational patrols of the P-38 Lightning marked the of an era that had redefined the very nature of air combat. As the sun began to set on the Pacific theater, the silver silhouettes of these twin-boom fighters cast long shadows over a landscape transformed by years of total war. To the men who flew them, the Lightning was more than a weapon. It was a sanctuary of altitude and speed, a guardian that had carried them across thousands of miles of unforgiving ocean. To the enemies who faced it, it was a terrifying presence that seemed to defy the traditional physics of dogfighting. When we examine the lasting shadow of the P-38, we find a lineage that stretches far beyond the 1940s. The aircraft was the first great masterpiece of Clarence Kelly Johnson, the visionary engineer who would go on to lead Lockheed's Leggery Skunk Works. The lessons learned in the cockpit of the Lightning, the complexities of compressibility, the management of heat in high-performance engines, and the necessity of pilot-centric design became the bedrock of the jet age. If you look closely at the sleek, aggressive lines of the modern F-22 Raptor or the long-range strike capabilities of current multi-role fighters, you are seeing the DNA of the P-38. It broke the mold by proving that a fighter could be both a heavy hitter and a nimble interceptor, a scout and a bomber, a protector and a predator. In the hands of legs like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, the Lightning became the instrument of America's highest-scoring aces. At 10 a.m. on a typical morning in the South Pacific, a pilot might find himself cruising at 30,000 feet, his engines humming in a synchronized rhythm that no single-engine plane could ever replicate. This redundancy was not just about safety, it was about confidence. It allowed pilots to push deeper into enemy territory than any other fighter of the time. When a P-38 appeared on the horizon, it signaled that nowhere was safe and no distance was too great for American air power to bridge. The aircraft's legacy is also written in the fear it inspired. German pilots in North Africa and Europe famously dubbed it the fork-tailed devil. This was not merely a nickname born of its unique appearance, but a testament to its concentrated firepower. By mounting 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon directly in the nose, Kelly Johnson eliminated the need for converging fire. A Lightning pilot did not have to worry about a sweet spot in distance. If the target was in the crosshairs, it was already within a wall of lead and steel. This innovation changed the tactical approach to strafing and aerial duels forever. By 2 p.m. on any given day during the height of the conflict, hundreds of these machines would be in the air simultaneously across multiple continents, performing roles that their designers had only dreamed of. Yet, for all its technological prowess, the true weight of the P-38's history lies in the silence of the post-war years. As the jet engine reared piston-driven aircraft obsolete, thousands of Lightnings were scrapped, melted down to build the consumer goods of a booming post-war America. Only a handful remain today, their polished aluminum skins reflecting the curiosity of new generations at air shows and museums. They stand as monuments to a moment in time when human ingenuity was pushed to its absolute breaking point to meet the demands of global survival. The P-38 Lightning did more than just break the rules of air combat. It rewrote the manual on what an airplane could be. It was a bridge between the romantic era of the biplane and the cold, calculated efficiency of the supersonic era. It taught us that innovation often requires a radical departure from the familiar, and that the greatest risks often yield the most alluring rewards. As we look back at those twin streaks of white vapor trailing across the blue expanse of history, we are reminded that the Lightning was never just a machine of war. It was a manifestation of the courage required to look at the impossible and see a path forward. It remains a timeless symbol of the human spirit's refusal to be grounded by the limitations of the present. The shadow of the Lightning does not darken our history. It illuminates the path of those who continue to reach for the horizon, proving that even in the darkest storms of conflict, a flash of brilliance can change the world forever.